My parents favored my brother for 20 years. Then, everything changed. Hi, welcome back to my channel. Please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon for upcoming more interesting videos.
My name is Lauren Mitchell. I am 29 years old and I live in Denver, Colorado. And for most of my life, I felt like I was living in the shadow of someone else, that someone was my older brother. Jason in our family, Jason, was always the center of attention, the one everyone believed in, the one our parents proudly talked about to relatives, neighbors, and friends. Growing up, I quickly learned that no matter what I achieved, it would never receive the same excitement or praise, because in our house, Jason was the golden child, and I was simply the other kid who was expected to behave, stay responsible, and not cause problems. When we were younger, the difference was small enough that I did not fully understand it. Jason received bigger birthday gifts, new gadgets, and constant encouragement, while I received practical things that our parents said would help me become independent. They always told me I was mature for my age, which at first sounded like a compliment, but over time I realized it really meant they expected me to handle things on my own, without needing their attention. If Jason forgot homework or got into trouble at school, our parents blamed the teacher or said he was just going through a phase. But when I made even the smallest mistake, it became a lecture about responsibility and discipline. I remember working extremely hard in school, believing that if I brought home perfect grades, maybe my parents would finally look at me the way they looked at Jason. But even when I succeeded, the response was calm and almost predictable. They said it was expected from someone like me because I was the responsible one. Meanwhile, Jason's average performance was celebrated like a huge achievement. Family dinners often turned into conversations about his future, his potential, and the amazing things he would supposedly accomplish someday. While I sat quietly listening, even though I had dreams and goals of my own, I learned early that speaking about them rarely changed anything. As the years passed, the difference between us only grew larger. Jason developed a habit of jumping from one interest to another. He talked about becoming an entrepreneur, starting businesses, or finding some exciting career that would make him successful quickly. Our parents listened to these ideas with excitement and encouragement, even when those plans changed every few months. On the other hand, I focused on building a realistic future. I studied carefully, planned my education, and thought about careers that could actually provide stability. But somehow that practicality made my parents less interested in my path because it was not dramatic or impressive in their eyes. The turning point came when we both reached the stage of life where the future started becoming real. Jason struggled in college and eventually dropped out, claiming that traditional education was not right for him. Instead of criticizing the decision, our parents defended him, saying that successful people often follow unconventional paths. They believed he simply needed time and support to discover his true potential. Around the same time, I was finishing my own studies and preparing to enter a career that required patience, organization, and long hours. It was not glamorous, but it was something I believed could give me independence and stability. Instead of encouragement, I received quiet skepticism from my parents. They seemed disappointed that I had chosen something so ordinary compared to the big dreams. Jason constantly described hearing those reactions was painful, but it also forced me to accept a truth I had been avoiding for years. The approval I wanted from my parents might never come, no matter how responsible or successful I became. That realization slowly changed the way I looked at my family. I stopped trying to compete for attention that was already promised to someone else, and instead focused on building a life where my achievements mattered to me rather than to them. It was not an easy shift, because part of me still hoped that someday they would recognize the effort I had invested into creating a stable future. However, deep down I knew that the family dynamic was unlikely to change after so many years of favoritism. What I did not know at that time was that the story my parents believed about Jason's success was slowly moving toward a moment that would force everyone in our family to see the truth differently. And when that moment finally arrived, the roles between the golden child and the overlooked daughter would change in ways none of us could have predicted after realizing that my parents were unlikely to ever see me the same way they saw Jason. I slowly began shifting my focus away from their expectations and toward building a life that actually made sense for me. Leaving home was not a dramatic moment, but rather a quiet decision that happened gradually as I prepared for independence. I found a small apartment near the edge of the city where the rent was affordable and started working long hours while continuing my education at the same time. The early years were exhausting because balancing work responsibilities with school required constant discipline. But there was also a strange sense of peace in knowing that every step forward was the result of my own effort rather than someone else's approval. I worked mornings at a small office handling administrative tasks and spent evenings studying project management and business organization, subjects that fascinated me because they showed how structure, planning, and patience could turn small ideas into stable results. Life during those years was simple and sometimes difficult, but it was also the first time I truly felt in control of my future. While I was slowly building that independence, Jason continued living in a completely different reality. According to the occasional updates I heard from relatives, he was constantly exploring new opportunities. One month he would talk about launching an online company, another month he would be researching investments or planning some exciting project that promised quick success. Our parents always seemed eager to support these ideas, providing financial help, encouragement, and endless belief that Jason was only one step away from becoming extremely successful. Whenever I visited home during holidays, the conversations around the dinner table rarely changed. My parents spoke proudly about Jason's potential and the incredible things they believed he would accomplish someday, while my own progress was treated as predictable because I had chosen what they called a safe path. Although their comments still stung occasionally, I had learned not to react the same way I once did. Instead, I listened quietly and reminded myself that the stability I was building mattered even if they did not recognize it as impressive. Over time, my career slowly developed in ways that surprised even me. After finishing my education, I secured a position as a junior project coordinator at a growing logistics company. The work required organization, problem solving, and constant communication between different departments. But I enjoyed the challenge because every completed project felt like a real accomplishment. The experience I gained during those early years allowed me to move into larger roles, managing more complex operations, and eventually leading teams responsible for coordinating large-scale contracts. The job demanded patience and consistency, qualities I had developed long ago while trying to meet expectations that once seemed impossible to satisfy. Financially, my life became stable enough that I no longer worried about the basic struggles that defined my early adulthood. I paid off my student loans, saved money, and even moved into a better apartment closer to the center of the city. Yet despite those achievements, my relationship with my parents remained distant. We spoke occasionally during holidays or family events, but the emotional gap between us never fully closed. I sensed that they still viewed my life as respectable but ordinary compared to the exciting possibilities they imagined for Jason. Rather than arguing or trying to change their opinions, I slowly reduced the amount of contact we had because protecting my peace became more important than seeking validation that might never come. Meanwhile, Jason's life continued, moving from one plan to another without ever settling into anything stable. Each time a project failed, our parents stepped in again, offering financial support or encouragement that allowed him to try something new. Relatives often described him as ambitious, someone who simply needed the right opportunity to finally succeed. But from a distance, I began noticing a pattern that worried me. The constant rescue from consequences seemed to prevent him from learning the same lessons that had shaped my own independence. Still, I chose not to interfere because I had spent too many years trying to correct a dynamic that no one else in the family wanted to question. Life continued this way for several more years, with my career steadily improving and my distance from family drama growing wider. until one day, a sudden piece of news reached me through a relative news that suggested Jason's latest opportunity might not be another harmless experiment, but something far more serious, something that would soon force everyone in our family to face a reality. None of them were prepared to accept. Several years passed, with my life moving forward in a steady, predictable way, while Jason continued chasing opportunities that always seemed exciting in the beginning but rarely lasted long enough to become real success. I focused on my work, growing more confident in the career I had built and slowly creating a routine that felt stable and peaceful. Most days were filled with meetings, planning schedules, and managing projects that required careful coordination between different teams. And even though the job demanded patience, it also gave me a sense of purpose that had been missing earlier in my life. During that time, I rarely heard direct updates about Jason from my parents, because our conversations were still brief and polite rather than open and personal. However, information about him still reached me occasionally through extended family members who mentioned his latest plans or the new ventures he believed would finally lead to the breakthrough he had been searching for. One of those updates caught my attention more than the others, because this time the scale of the opportunity sounded much larger than anything he had attempted before. According to what I heard, Jason had convinced our parents that he had discovered a promising business idea connected to a fast-growing market. He explained that the project had huge potential and only needed the right investment to begin producing serious profits. Our parents, who had always believed in his ability to succeed, were immediately excited by the possibility and agreed to support him financially. The plan involved investing a significant portion of their savings while also securing additional funds through loans that would allow the project to grow quickly from the outside. The story sounded impressive and hopeful, exactly the type of opportunity Jason had always promised would eventually appear. And although I felt a quiet sense of concern, I chose not to interfere because I had spent too many years trying to question decisions that my parents never wanted to reconsider. At first, everything seemed to go exactly the way Jason predicted. Relatives talked about the new venture with excitement, describing meetings, partnerships, and early progress that suggested the idea might actually work. Our parents proudly shared updates with anyone who asked about their son, convinced that his long-awaited success was finally beginning to take shape. However, as months passed, the optimistic reports became less frequent. The small pieces of information that reached me began sounding different, subtle hints that something was not going as smoothly as expected. I heard that certain partners had stepped away from the project, and that some financial agreements had become more complicated than originally planned. Those details were never explained fully, but the tone surrounding the situation had clearly shifted from excitement to uncertainty. Eventually, the rumors grew more serious, suggesting that the business was struggling to stay afloat, and that the money invested had not produced the results everyone expected. Despite those warning signs, our parents continued standing by Jason, believing that temporary difficulties were simply part of building a successful company. They reassured relatives that everything was under control, and that Jason only needed more time to turn things around. But behind those confident statements, the reality was becoming harder to hide. The debts connected to the project were increasing, and the financial pressure attached to them was no longer limited to Jason, because our parents had supported him so strongly. Their own savings and assets were tied to the same agreements. What began as an exciting investment opportunity slowly transformed into a situation filled with risk and uncertainty. As I listened to these updates from a distance, I felt a strange mixture of concern and familiarity. The pattern looked painfully similar to the dynamic that had shaped our family for years. Jason chasing ambitious dreams, our parents believing in him without hesitation, and the consequences growing larger each time reality failed to match expectation. Yet this time, the scale of the problem seemed far greater than anything that had happened before, and I could sense that the situation was approaching a point where it would no longer remain hidden. Within quiet family conversations, eventually, the moment arrived when the truth began spreading openly among relatives, revealing that the project had collapsed completely, leaving behind financial damage much larger than anyone expected. And as the full details started emerging, it became clear that the same parents who had spent years ignoring my life and decisions were now facing a crisis that might soon force them to reach out to the one person they had always believed would never be part of solving their problems. Not long after the news about Jason's failed business began spreading through the family, I received a message from my mother asking if we could meet in person. The request itself felt unusual, because for many years our conversations had been brief and distant, usually limited to holidays or quick updates about everyday life. The tone of the message carried a seriousness that immediately made me realize something important had changed. We arranged to meet at my parents' house, the same place where I had grown up, and as I drove there, memories of the past returned more clearly than I expected. The neighborhood looked almost exactly the same: quiet streets, familiar houses, and the same trees lining the sidewalks. Yet the feeling was different because I was no longer the person who had once tried so hard to fit into the expectations that existed inside that home. When I arrived, I noticed that the atmosphere inside the house felt heavy and tense. My parents greeted me politely, but the warmth that used to appear when they talked about Jason's achievements was completely missing. Instead, there was a sense of worry that seemed to follow every movement and every conversation. We sat down in the living room, and after a few quiet moments, my father began explaining the situation. The rumors I had heard earlier were only a small part of what had actually happened. The business Jason started had not simply struggled, it had collapsed completely, leaving behind large debts connected to loans, investments, and financial agreements that were far more serious than anyone in the family originally understood. Because our parents had supported Jason so strongly, their names were tied to several of those agreements, which meant the consequences of the failure had reached them directly. The money they invested was gone, and the loans connected to the project were now becoming their responsibility as well. Hearing those details made the situation feel much more real than the distant rumors I had heard before. My parents explained that the financial pressure was growing quickly, and that if they could not find a way to manage the debts, they might eventually lose the house they had lived in for decades. The place that had once been the center of our family life was now at risk because of decisions that had been made with confidence and trust in Jason's future. As they spoke, I noticed something I had never seen before. The certainty that once surrounded Jason had completely disappeared for the first time. My parents sounded unsure about what would happen next. The belief that their son would eventually succeed had carried them through years of small setbacks, but now that belief was being tested by a reality that could not easily be explained away. After describing the full situation, they turned the conversation toward my life, asking questions about my work, my finances, and the stability I had created over the years. The sudden interest felt strange, because for most of my adulthood those topics had rarely seemed important to them, but now their curiosity carried a different meaning. It became clear that they believed I might be able to help solve the crisis that had developed around them. Although they did not ask directly at first, the expectation slowly became obvious. They hoped that the independence and stability I had built might allow me to step in and provide the financial support that Jason could not offer himself. Sitting there listening to their concerns, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me felt sympathy, because despite everything, they were still my parents, and seeing them worried about losing their home was painful. But another part of me could not ignore the years of favoritism, and the way my life had always been treated as less important than Jason's dreams. Now, the roles had shifted in a way none of us expected. The daughter who had once been overlooked was now the one with the ability to help, while the golden child who received endless support had become the source of the problem. The room grew quiet as the conversation slowed, and I realized that the decision I made next would shape the future of our relationship. in a way that nothing else ever had, because for the first time in our family history, the responsibility for choosing what happened next did not belong to Jason or to our parents. It belonged entirely to me. After hearing the full truth about the financial crisis my parents were facing, I spent several days thinking carefully about what I should do. The situation was complicated, not only because of the money involved, but also because it forced me to confront years of family history that had shaped the relationship between all of us. Part of me still carried the memory of being the child who tried endlessly to earn approval, while watching Jason receive praise and support no matter what choices he made. Yet another part of me understood that holding on to resentment forever would only keep the past controlling my future. Eventually, I decided that my response needed to be honest, balanced, and guided by the boundaries I had spent years learning to protect. When I met my parents again, I explained that I was willing to help them create a plan to manage the situation, but that I would not provide a financial rescue for Jason himself. The difference between those two things was important to me, because helping my parents stabilize their lives felt reasonable while continuing the pattern of protecting Jason from the consequences of his decisions would only repeat the same cycle that had created the problem in the first place. At first, the conversation was uncomfortable because my parents were not used to hearing firm boundaries from me. For most of my life, I had been the quiet daughter who accepted whatever expectations were placed on her, but now the years of independence had changed that dynamic. I described the practical options available, including restructuring the debts, negotiating payment plans, and possibly selling certain assets before the situation grew worse. My experience in project management had taught me how to break complicated problems into smaller, manageable steps, and for the first time, my parents listened carefully to the strategies I was explaining. The process took time, patience, and many difficult discussions, but slowly we began building a plan that could prevent the complete collapse of their financial stability. During those weeks, Jason remained mostly absent from the conversations, dealing with the consequences of the failed business, while also facing the reality that the constant protection he once received was no longer available. Watching that shift happen was strange, because it revealed how deeply the old family dynamic had depended on everyone continuing the same roles. Once those roles changed, the entire structure of our relationships started transforming in ways none of us expected. My parents gradually acknowledged that their years of favoritism had influenced the situation more than they realized. By always believing Jason would eventually succeed without holding him accountable, they had unintentionally encouraged a pattern where responsibility was delayed, rather than learned. Hearing them admit that truth did not erase the past, but it created space for a more honest relationship. Moving forward, as the financial situation slowly stabilized through careful planning and difficult adjustments, I began visiting them more often, not as the overlooked daughter searching for approval, but as an adult who had built her own life through patience and discipline. The change in how they treated me was noticeable. They asked for my opinion, respected my decisions, and seemed genuinely interested in the career and independence I had created over the years. Jason's path remained uncertain as he worked through the consequences of his choices, but for the first time he had to face those challenges without the safety net that had always been waiting for him. Looking back at everything that happened, I realized that the moment my parents once feared the most, losing the image of their golden child, had actually forced our family to confront truths that had been ignored for decades. The quiet, responsible life I built had never been dramatic or exciting, but in the end it proved stronger than the promises of quick success that once overshadowed it. And while our family would never erase the past, the experience changed the way we understood each other, reminding all of us that real stability does not come from favoritism or blind belief, but from accountability, patience, and the quiet determination to build something lasting, even when no one is watching.